In the pressures and crises of everyday life, we tend to forget our past, the events that shaped our lives but which now survive as a faint memory or a rusty statue barely noticed. One such event was the First World War. World War I, the war to end war, was over. It was time to create a permanent peace. It is also the moment in time that begins our series. We now have the benefit of time and perspective to examine the crucial period that begins with the Paris Peace Conference and ends with Pearl Harbor. This first program is a story of a president determined to end that hallowed isolationist tradition of American foreign policy and the tragedy that resulted. It was a cold, gray morning when the George Washington eased out of New York Harbor. President Woodrow Wilson was her most distinguished passenger, sailing on a crucial mission to negotiate, in his terms, a just and lasting peace, and to establish a new world order to prevent war, a mission which to Woodrow Wilson was sacred. The president was jaunty and full of optimism. He believed in divine providence, that he had been chosen to dictate the terms of peace. He surrounded himself with enthusiastic men who shared his vision. Fight for what is right, he told them, and I will support you. For his peace team, he gathered about him an impressive group of scholars and experts, the best and the brightest of 1918. Wilson believed the president ruled absolute in foreign affairs, and this was his own special mission. In his words, peace without victory. The First World War, however, left no victors. The sight of the victors, thousands of them returning home as refugees in a destroyed land, went largely unrecorded in the United States. The American view of France was a stage set for the entrance of Woodrow Wilson. Paris gave President Wilson a welcome that would have warmed the heart of a Caesar or a Napoleon. It was as if the Messiah had arrived. The cheering confirmed Wilson's view that he alone would shape the peace. Versailles, the elegant residence of King Louis XIV. Here in 1871, Germany had dictated peace terms to the French. Now France would repay the humiliation. Soon the Hall of Mirrors would be crowded with men who matured in the 19th century, when international affairs were guided by the bloodlines of royalty. President Wilson wanted to end the old system of alliances, power balances, and secret diplomacy. That would be difficult in Paris, which one delegate described as a psychotic city where everyone was morbid. The symbol of French hostility and bitterness was its 77-year-old Prime Minister, Georges Clemenceau. He had one great love, France, and one great hate, Germany. He was puzzled by Wilson's idealism. After all, France had been saved by bayonets, not by words. British Prime Minister Lloyd George brought his mistress and a desire to trade with Germany. The chaos of Versailles would leave an indelible impression on future world leaders. Winston Churchill was there as Britain's Minister of War, and he was appalled at how unprepared the peacemakers were. Prince Faisal of Arabia was there with the mysterious Lawrence. Whatever unity Lawrence had welded among the Arabs was shattered by the secret agreements between European powers. A young revolutionist from French Indochina was there to seek a Bill of Rights for his people. He requested an audience with President Wilson and was refused. His name was Ho Chi Minh. Young Herbert Hoover was in Belgium administering the food relief program there. The future world leader who would have to pay dearly years later for the failings of Versailles was President Wilson's vigorous young Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Relegated to a military mission, he nonetheless witnessed close up the diplomatic cynicism that disembodied Germany. In Germany, a violent power struggle between moderate and radical Bolsheviks erupted in Berlin. It was called the Spartacus Revolt, and it threatened the fragile new democratic regime in that country. Since the Russian Revolution in 1917, communism had threatened to sweep Europe. The German army crushed the Spartacus uprisings in January 1919, just as the peace conference was opening. The final peace settlement would be shaped by the personalities of Wilson, Clemenceau, Lloyd George, and Orlando. But another name must be added, the name of one of the most mysterious figures in American politics, Wilson's personal advisor, Colonel Edward M. House of Texas. Colonel House was a Texas politician who relied on shrewdness and manipulation to get his way. A quiet family man, he became Woodrow Wilson's personal advisor and friend. When they first met, Wilson took to him immediately. "He is my second personality," said Wilson, "my alter ego. His thoughts and mine are one." Colonel House reached new heights in Paris as one of America's 5 peace delegates. He was secretly proud that he had a larger staff than either the Secretary of State or the President. Operating from a secure power base, Colonel House was the only person in Paris who enjoyed the President's confidence. The President was optimistic when he left temporarily for the United States to take care of domestic matters. His coveted League of Nations was now part of the peace treaty. He placed all his faith in it, and all his trust in Colonel House, who would handle the delicate negotiations while he was away. Woodrow Wilson returned to a post-war America that was undergoing a revolution in values and behavior. It had become fashionable to scoff at religion, respectability, reformers, and politicians. When the George Washington left New York Harbor for Wilson's return to France in early March, there was no pomp or display. The President played shuffleboard with his doctor, Admiral Cary Grayson, who worried about Wilson's health. The Senate had just issued a dictum that the peace treaty was unacceptable in its present form. It dealt a severe blow to the President's peace hopes, and he took it personally. Colonel House carried on negotiations in Paris while Woodrow Wilson was away in the United States. He was convinced that compromise with Clemenceau was not only necessary, but inevitable. In his offices at the Hotel Crillon, House held secret meetings with Clemenceau and Lloyd George. His main drive was to wrap up a peace treaty with Germany as soon as possible, and this required compromise. When Wilson arrived in France and found out what House had done, he was shocked. Having lost faith in Colonel House, the President still could not turn to his Secretary of State. Wilson and Robert Lansing were not on good terms. Lansing had serious differences with the President about the war. Lansing was a pragmatic lawyer, a realist. Wilson thought he was unimaginative and suspected his loyalty. Lansing did not put much faith in the League of Nations. He did not believe it would solve international conflicts. President Wilson never forgave him for that, and at Versailles ignored and humiliated his Secretary of State. The strain and confusion of the peace conference intensified. In the words of one delegate, it was like a riot in a parrot house. There was the machine gun rattle of a million typewriters, the incessant shrilling of telephones, the cold voices of interpreters, and behind it all, the ache and exhaustion of despair. At one point, Clemenceau called Wilson a pro-German. Wilson stood his ground, insisting that the League of Nations would prevent future German aggression. Clemenceau scoffed at the proud Wilson, who, he said, talked like Jesus Christ, but acted like Lloyd George. Influenza, a new and unexpected element, surfaced in Paris. It was an unusually virulent strain which had reached pandemic proportions in the winter of 1918. In 1 year, influenza claimed 25 million lives, more than the total number of deaths in World War I. On the afternoon of April 3rd, Woodrow Wilson became a victim. The fever-racked president was confined to this room for 5 days. Wilson's illness threatened to break up the peace conference. The president was forced to rely heavily on Colonel House, an odd choice considering their recent differences, but Wilson had no one else to turn to. Clemenceau and Lloyd George met in Woodrow Wilson's study, while the dutiful Colonel House shuttled messages back and forth to the president's bedroom. It was the most crucial time of the peace conference. Wilson and the Allies were at an impasse over war reparations and the occupation of Germany. The crafty Clemenceau and the clever Lloyd George had won out. Wilson's world seemed to collapse around him. Italy's Prime Minister, Orlando, walked out of the peace conference when Wilson refused to give Italy the Adriatic seaport, Fiume. On June 28, 1919, the victors and the vanquished gathered at the Palace of Versailles to sign the Paris Peace Treaty, officially ending World War I. The Treaty of Versailles was a severe peace treaty. It forced Germany to admit war guilt, disarmed her, stripped her of her colonies, and demanded war reparations in the billions of dollars, which would be impossible to pay. The issues were decided in private meetings where stubborn demands for territory outweighed any principle of justice. We tend to view Versailles as a hall full of people rushing about in search of peace. In truth, they found calamity. A young corporal wounded in the war vowed to avenge what he later called the stab in the back of Versailles. His name was Adolf Hitler. Germany, stripped of honor, was blockaded during the peace negotiations. No food was available until the treaty was signed. And in one of history's gratuitous cruelties, the blockade of Germany continued for 2 more weeks. Thousands of Germans died of starvation. The bitterness would be long remembered. An ideal treaty was an impossible goal. The passions and hatreds of World War I were too strong. The obstacles Wilson faced were insurmountable. But compromise proved fatal. If one extreme or the other had won out, the results might have been longer lasting. A tougher, more ruthless peace of conquest might have kept Germany down. A more just and liberal peace might have averted the conditions in Germany that encouraged Hitler. In the end, the Germans blamed Woodrow Wilson for the Versailles Treaty. The German government said, President Wilson is a hypocrite, and the Versailles Treaty is the vilest crime in history. We must never forget it is only a scrap of paper. Do not lose hope, the day of resurrection comes. Woodrow Wilson had spent a heady 2 months at the Paris Peace Conference in Europe. Returning through the port of Boston, he considered himself the victor in all the battles waged at Versailles. At home, he expected to secure the congressional stamp of approval for the League of Nations without a problem. The heartening sound of welcome drew the president into a serious blunder. He chose to announce his peace program to a gathering in Boston. But Boston was the home city of Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, dedicated opponent of Wilsonian internationalism. Wilson's speech would be doubly inappropriate since he had asked the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, which Lodge headed, to remain silent on the League until he met with them. Wilson violated his own request by speaking in Boston. He did not mention Lodge's name, but declared that any man who resists the League will find himself cast away by humanity. I have fighting blood in me, Wilson said, and it is sometimes a delight to let it have scope. The Foreign Relations Committee was delighted to accept the challenge. It was dominated by a group of senators opposed to the League of Nations in any form. Lodge headed the committee, but he was ably supported by master obstructionists known as the Irreconcilables. Senator Frank Brandegee of Connecticut, cynical, morose, and bitter, planned much of the strategy. Philander Knox of Pennsylvania was the legal brains of the bitter enders. Joseph Medill McCormick of Illinois, the conservative publisher, was a chief fundraiser. Albert Fall of New Mexico, later a key figure in President Harding's Teapot Dome scandal. James Reed of Missouri, an iconoclast and maverick, a Wilson hater and an isolationist. Hiram Johnson of California was the rabble-rouser of the group, one of the great stump speakers of his time. Senator William Borah, the eloquent, passionate isolationist from Idaho, was a spiritual leader of the group. The irreconcilables devised a shrewd tactic to undermine the president. It was called the round robin. Senator Lodge presented the resolution to the Senate, which declared that the League of Nations in its present form is unacceptable. 37 senators had signed it, which meant that Wilson could not get a two-thirds majority. A few days later, Lodge gave his most eloquent speech against the League, fittingly in Boston.
You may call me selfish, if you will, conservative or reactionary, or use any other harsh adjective you see fit to apply. But an American I was born, an American I have remained all my life. I can never be anything else but an American, and I must think of the United States first. I have loved but one flag, and I cannot share that devotion and give affection to the mongrel banner invented for a league.
Post-war America was, in the words of one senator, in a state of shell shock. The focal point of agitation was an uneasy American labor movement. In 1919, 4 million workers walked off the job in 3,600 different strikes. The most violent disorders were the race riots that summer. The great general issue was not Wilson's League of Nations, but the high cost of living.
Well, people thought that he was negative and was against any kind of peace organization. Well, that really is not true. His position was that he favored ratifying the League of Nations covenant with reservations. And the principle of one of those reservations was the one that said that U.S. troops would only be used subject to a resolution of Congress. In other words, denying the League of Nations the power to order out U.S. troops. Well, today, nobody would think of saying that the United Nations ought to have the right to order out U.S. troops. There's a good deal of feeling that the U.S. government shouldn't have the right to order out U.S. troops.
Lodge, the patrician from Boston, found a natural ally in the populist from Idaho, William Borah.
It was the conviction of two of the greatest statesmen the world has ever known, Washington and Jefferson, that to involve this nation in European political problems was to undermine and ultimately destroy the whole scheme of our free institutions. Give us an American policy, a policy suitable to American institutions and conforming at all times to American ideas.
This is Borah country, unmovable in its attachment to isolation. Borah's hometown, Boise, was like most small towns in rural America. Its main street is a continuation of main streets everywhere. The only ardent new topics were prohibition, the place where you could get whiskey at $13 a quart, recipes for homemade beer, the high cost of living, the presidential election, Clark's new car. Their problems were exactly what they had been 2 years ago, what they had been 20 years ago, and what they would be for 20 years to come. On July 4th, 1919, President Woodrow Wilson was at sea on his way back from the Paris Peace Conference. The president was tired of compromise. He was in a fighting mood. When he left Paris, he told Colonel House, "I have found one can never get anything in this life that is worthwhile without fighting for it." On July 10th, the president formally presented the peace treaty to the Senate. "Dare we reject it and break the heart of the world?" he asked. As he spoke, Republican senators sat in stern silence. His words rang out. The stage is set, the destiny disclosed, we cannot turn back. The president did not realize it yet, but forces other than the irreconcilables had lined up against him. A new coalition was gaining strength. Opposition to Wilson came from still another unexpected source, the militant wing of the women's suffrage movement. Suffragette Alice Paul accused the president of neglecting the issue. Women's suffrage would soon be left behind. The immediate issue was the League of Nations. Wilson went to the people for support. As the president left, the irreconcilables sent their own speakers, known as the Battalion of Death, to hound him at every turn. The grueling train trip covered 8,000 miles. The president wrote and delivered 40 speeches. There was the heat, the smoke, the cinders, the dust, the endless handshaking, the receptions, the motorcades. Senators Johnson and Bora followed him.
We are plunging into the very heart of Europe and seizing hold of their problems.
Leave her to march freely through the centuries to come, as in the years that have gone.
Give us a policy suitable to American institutions and conforming at all times to American ideals.
In San Diego, a delirious crowd of 50,000 filled Balboa Stadium to hear the president. He was exhausted, suffering severe headaches. A newfangled contraption called a public address system was used for the first time. It made speaking much easier, but the voices of Lodge and Bora haunted him.
We are dealing with nations, every one of which has a direct individual interest to serve.
It was the conviction of Washington and Jefferson that to involve this nation in European political problems,
there is grave danger in an unshared idealism.
And ultimately destroy.
In Pueblo, Colorado, Woodrow Wilson gave the last speech of his public career. The president's fragile health gave way. His head throbbed in pain. He had trouble focusing. Dr. Grayson canceled the rest of the trip and rushed him home. 5 days later, Wilson suffered a severe stroke. Wilson was desperately ill, but neither the cabinet nor the public was aware of his critical condition. The president's mind was clear, but he was physically enfeebled and emotionally upset. Mrs. Wilson shielded her husband from anything that might alarm him. She isolated him from the outside world. Just 2 days before the crucial vote on the treaty, this is how Woodrow Wilson looked. Colonel House, a tired and sick man, tried unsuccessfully to see the president. He had sent 3 letters to Wilson urging him to compromise. They were not answered. November 19th, 1919. It was time for the Senate to vote on the League of Nations. President Wilson remained inflexible to the end and opposed any changes. He specifically objected to the Lodge reservations, which would limit American involvement in the League. Senator Lodge and the irreconcilables looked forward to the debate. There was no Democratic strategy. Cut off from the president, the Democratic leader, Gilbert Hitchcock, did his valiant best for the League.
The trouble with senators who oppose the League of Nations is that they are thinking of the days that are gone and gone forever.
Beware how you trifle with your marvelous inheritance. For if we stumble and fall, freedom and civilization everywhere will go down in ruin.
The confidence of men in government has been shaken. It will never be restored until government devise some way to end war. The League of Nations is that way.
The Senate rejected the Versailles Peace Treaty that day because Woodrow Wilson refused to compromise. He had instructed Democrats to vote against the treaty with Lodge's reservations.
I felt that if President Wilson had been in his usual good health, a compromise could have been reached, and the United States might well have joined the League of Nations. But President Wilson was suffering from a stroke, and he insisted on all or nothing. He insisted that, as to use his own phrase, it should be ratified without the dotting of an I or the crossing of a T. And of course, he couldn't get a 2/3 vote for that proposition.
On Inauguration Day 1921, a solemn Woodrow Wilson listened as President-elect Warren Harding put an end to Wilsonian internationalism.
But I have a confidence in our America that requires no council of foreign powers to point the way of American duty. Call it the selfishness of nationality, if you will. I think it's an inspiration to patriotic devotion, to safeguard America first, to stabilize America first, to prosper America first, to think of America first, to exalt America first, to live for and revere America first. Let the internationalist dream and the Bolshevists destroy. In the spirit of the Republic, we proclaim Americanism and acclaim America.
Woodrow Wilson, the incurable idealist, lost the most important battle of his career, and it was unnecessary. Had Wilson compromised, the United States would have joined the League of Nations, and we'll never know how that might have changed history. In the words of one historian, with his own sickly hands, Wilson slew his own brainchild. He could not stand compromise, and this was his tragic flaw. He had a moral view of life that saw issues in black and white with no shades of gray. In the end, we took the advice of George Washington, who had warned against entangling foreign alliances. We reverted to our traditional isolationism. And in the course of events, the U.S. Senate laid both hands on foreign policy, a control it would not give up until December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor Day.